I'm in Visual Studio and I've opened my demo project from before. I haven't got any files or tabs opened, nor have I got a previously started active Copilot chat session. In other words, I'm as good as starting from scratch. In such a case, Copilot has very little context to take into account. Let's add a new class. Let's name it nextdemo.cs. There's not much context to be learned from that either. That's not to say that nothing can be generated. As you can see, if all I have got is the class definition, Copilot thinks it's a good idea to create a run method. That's actually not too bad, taken into account that there's almost zero context. But anyway, we don't want that. Say that we want to create an API endpoint for a RESTful API that creates an order. Let's ask for that. Copilot suggests to create an order controller class that derives from API controller. That's not bad. Then it tries to create a createOrder method, annotated with the HTTP post attribute, which creates an order. The order class doesn't exist yet, but let's accept this for now. Right? And if we continue, an order class is generated with a bunch of properties that Copilot thinks belong in an order class. And if we look at what we've got here, well, it doesn't compile, obviously, because we have a few namespace issues and we definitely need to reference a few things. But all in all, it is not that bad. The first code suggestion was to create an order controller class. If I accept that, what happens is that the second suggestion already takes this first part here into account and then knows that in something that derives from API controller, the HTTP post attribute must be used to link post requests to a specific action on a controller. The third suggestion then creates the order class the second suggestion refers to. Interesting fact here is that my existing order class is not used. I didn't open it, and I also didn't reference it with hashtag to the file location, so GitHub Copilot does not take it into account. That being said, it's not bad, but Copilot did have to guess a lot. What we provided was way too generic. This is not setting the stage. This is not a high-level goal. It's just a generic, not thought-out command. Create a web API endpoint for creating an order. So how do you fix this then? Well, Copilot is your pair programmer. So write it down in the same way you would when starting a pair programming session. Think about the problem and then break it down in pieces that you write down. So let me remove this and let's improve on this. So, create a web API endpoint for creating an order. We can leave that as is. But now we're going to be more specific. We are going to set the stage. We're going to state the name of the controller, for example. The controller must be named order controller. What you see is that Copilot now starts suggesting things itself. That may or may not be something you want to accept, but you do see that it is already creating prompts behind the scenes. The endpoint must be named createOrder is what is suggested. That sounds good to me, so let me accept that. The endpoint must accept a post request. That makes sense as well. Now let me say that I want the endpoint to be located at API/order. Alright, using system.collections.generic, that is not what we need at this time. Let's keep on being a bit more specific. Now let's talk about the order class. So I'm going to say that the order class that's inputted is named order DTO and contains a name and a description property. Let's also say that we need some validation. So the order must be validated. If validation fails, I want to return a 400 bad request. And here Copilot is helping again by suggesting a 400 status code with the validation errors in the response body. Alright, And then let's be even more specific. How should the order be created? Well, typically you do that by calling into a business service or maybe directly into a repository. So let's state that the actual creation of the order must happen by calling into a repository method named addOrder on a repository named order_repository. And let's say that that repository must implement an interface, an iOrder_repository interface. All right, let me format this a bit better. There we go. And now let's see what happens. Not much was happening. I had to help Copilot a little bit by starting with the class definition, and that was quickly picked up. Copilot suggests an order controller class that derives from API controller. That's correct. If you look at the implementation, we see that the repository is used via the interface. So it suggests constructor injection here, which is what my intention was. From that moment on, we have the order repository. The post method is generated. The route is API/order, which is what I requested here. I also asked to validate the input. That's more or less okay, let's say. It checks whether the model state is valid or not, and depending on how you write your code, the incoming model will have been validated automatically. So this can potentially make sense. A bad request is returned with the errors in the response body, and I accept it. So what we've got here still isn't 100% correct. I may want to decide to organize my code a bit differently. I may want to rely on another way to do input validation. But nevertheless, this is already pretty helpful. That being said, some things are missing. For example, I see that an order DTO class is used here, which is indeed what I requested. But the definition itself isn't there. The order DTO class doesn't exist. It wasn't generated. Maybe if I ask for the next input, it is generated, and that is indeed the case. So there we go. That's already a bit better. The code we get here is quite okay. By setting the stage, we definitely improved what was suggested. Now, this is of course just one way of doing this. This is the inline approach. I'm not the biggest fan of this approach for generating large pieces of code like this. I prefer to use Copilot Chat for that. So let's see what that gives. I am simply going to copy-paste all of this and ask Copilot Chat the same. And there we go. What is generated here is more or less the same as what was previously generated via our inline approach, but I do feel that this code here is a bit more in line with what we need. I could have referenced the file I wanted this to end up in. I could have referenced the solution so it knew about the namespace. So the code could still be better. But next to that, most of what I asked, not everything, but most of what I asked is in here. This time, including the DTO directly and including the order repository interface definition. It also states that the implementation of iOrder_repository should be provided in the order repository class. So apparently it didn't have enough info to generate that. Nevertheless, this is much better than what we had without setting the stage. I can now just copy the code, insert it in a new file here, which is a nice way of working with GitHub Copilot Chat, or preview it in the currently open file. Let's try another example. Say that we want to create a secure web API endpoint and that we want to use JWT authentication for that. Let's see what gives. So, create a secure web API endpoint using JWT authentication. I seem to be getting a class definition for something named nextDemo and a run method with console.writeLine statement in there. That's not what I want. That is not what I want at all. Apparently, this type of input was not sufficient for Copilot to be able to generate something from it. Let me open the chat window and start a new thread, because I do not want anything from the previous part of the demo to be taken into account. Let's see what happens if I copy paste the prompt in Copilot Chat. That is already a lot more helpful. We get a generalized answer, but the answer is going towards what I would expect. Copilot is telling me to install the JWT Bearer package, which is typically what you would want to use for bearer token authentication with a web API. It states that I need to configure the JWT authentication in the startup.cs file, then create a controller that uses JWT for authentication, and then implement a mechanism to generate JWT tokens. I'm not sure about that last part here. That's not what I would do, but nevertheless, the output we get is already a lot better than what we got when using the inline approach here. If I look at the generated code, it's probably not completely correct, but it does help. But why is the output so different? Well, the thing is that you can also provide context that you do not want to provide. In this case, the context we provided was, well, an empty nextdemo.cs file with one namespace in it. It does take that into account, and apparently that kind of confused GitHub Copilot a bit in this case. It tried to keep on working with that nextDemo class and did not take the web API endpoint using JWT authentication request into account. This is not an exact science at all. Sometimes you have to work around some of the quirks that you might get. But the main thing is, when you are more specific, you will get better results. Let me rewrite that prompt here to get a web API endpoint using JWT authentication by being more specific. So I am going to change my prompt a little bit. I start with the exact same thing, but then I'm going to be more specific. I'm going to set the stage again. So I'm going to say that I want to configure authentication in startup by calling into add authentication and add JWT bearer. I also want an authentication controller with methods for getting a user logging in and logging out. So that is more than what we previously had. I want to validate user credentials in the login endpoint implementation, generate a JWT token and return that in the response. And I also state that the login endpoint should allow anonymous access. The endpoint for getting a user and logging out should require authorization. Let's give that a try. This is typically how you'd write it in a user story, right? All right, let's have a look at what it generated. It configures authentication in startup.cs just as I asked. It does a little bit more in regards to JWT bearer authentication, but nevertheless, this is a good start. It created the authentication controller as I asked, and it was able to do that because I was specific in what I asked, because I correctly set the stage. You also see that the login endpoint allows anonymous access just as I requested, and you also see that it tries to deserialize the request body to something of type user login. I didn't request that, but if I look below here, you see that user login contains a username and password. So that is exactly what my credentials would look like. Anyway, I could keep on going through this code, but the main thing here is that it will still require a bit of work, but it is a time saver, and the code generated was a lot better because we set the stage. Now, this technique is mainly useful when starting a new project. If you've been developing for a while, you'll have tabs open. You can include files with existing code and so on, so you have a lot of context to potentially provide. In those cases, there's much less need to set the high-level goal, although it doesn't hurt. On to the next best practice, providing examples.